Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver the week's top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impact these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Heather Wickline. Today, we have two special guests joining us today. First up is a true powerhouse. If you've been in the industry for a significant amount of time, you definitely will know her. She serves as the CEO of Akerna and became the first CEO of a cannabis ancillary company listed on the NASDAQ. Please welcome Jessica Billingsley.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor. And our next guest is our Chief Knowledge Officer here at New Frontier Data. Please welcome back John Kagia.
Thrilled to be here.
You're becoming a regular. I love it.
It's very exciting, very exciting.
Yes. Well, rather than run through this week's headlines, we are going to shake it up for this episode in honor of our guest, to have a discussion looking back in the past 6 years of legal cannabis sales in Colorado and hear kind of some insights on what the future may hold. Earlier this week, New Frontier Data published a phenomenal infographic in our CannaBit showing how the industry has grown tremendously and just a kind of different shifts in the industry. For our listeners, you can visit newfrontierData.com/CO-data. So I'm not going to rattle off a bunch of numbers, but a few notable ones I wanted to review. That over the past 6 years, legal cannabis has generated $7.8 billion in sales and 70% from adult use sales. And that's not including revenue along the supply chain from producers and processors or ancillary services and supporting sectors. So these numbers really, really highlight the economic value this industry is having on the state. And our second little tidbit is in 2014, flower was the dominant in sales, and now it accounts for less than half of products sold. So there's been a real big trend and shift in products. So without further ado, Jessica, I'd love to get started with you and just hear about what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in the last 6 years within Colorado and on a national level.
Sure, and going back to 6 years ago, maybe a great bridge there is the predictions that were made at that time about what would happen when Colorado legalized. That was maybe an interesting place to revisit from a historical perspective. I know that at the time I spoke with a number of journalists who were asking what is going to happen when Colorado shifts to this recreational market from having what was a very well-working, well-thriving medical market at the time. And I had a fairly contrarian view in that I predicted that we would actually see a very significant increase upon adult legalization and recreational marijuana passing. And most of the other industry experts and business leaders at the time were predicting that anyone who really was interested in consuming cannabis was already able to do so under the medical program. And maybe an interesting data point to report from that time is that in the first 2 months of adult legal cannabis sales in Colorado, our system showed that there were more sales made in those 2 months than in all of our prior years of inception in all of Colorado. So I think that's just maybe an interesting point to kick off, that there was quite a large population that was still waiting for adult legal and something that to keep in mind as we look nationwide at other states that are currently operating under a medical model that may be considering what does it look like if we shift to an adult legal model and what might that mean for tax revenue, for instance.
That's amazing. John, what would you say, in your insight, what would you think is like the biggest change?
So I think that's just building on Jessica's point, which I think is profoundly insightful. You know, there was a long-standing assumption that medical programs broadly served the needs and interests of cannabis consumers. And one of the things that I think Colorado really revealed, and to Jessica's point, very, very quickly, was just the prodigious appetite that Coloradans and Americans writ large have for cannabis. You know, the scale of the demand, I think, has exceeded even some of the most optimistic expectations. And you know, it really underscores that, you know, the opportunity presented by creating a legal, well-regulated, product-rich environment is really attractive for consumers who have continued to consume in the illicit market, regardless of what the law might be. And what legalization in Colorado has done really effectively is transition the majority of those consumers into this legal, well-regulated market. And two, created a huge wealth creation opportunity for the companies that have been effective in developing products, developing kind of retail environments that resonate with those consumers. So it's a phenomenal growth market, and given that we still only have, you know, a dozen states or a dozen jurisdictions where it's legal, where it's fully legal in the U.S., there's still a phenomenal amount of growth potential left, and Colorado is going to serve as a phenomenal kind of template and guide for how to capitalize on that opportunity.
I often like to say I come from the future. And speaking to emerging markets or other states or countries that are looking to legalize, and looking at, well, here's what we've seen in Colorado. And I know one of the trends that we had talked previously about discussing today is the shift over time that we're continuing to see post adult legal legalization here, in that we are continuing to see over time every year manufactured products gain market share. And that's, I think, an interesting topic as well.
I couldn't agree with that more. We actually just this week did a webinar, a webinar specifically on the infused product market, and just the scale of opportunity, the scale of innovation that's happened in that sector since Colorado legalized 6 years ago. And two, the amount of innovation that still has yet to happen. You know, there's a lot of kind of sense that the ship has sailed, that the kind of cars out of the station, but the reality is that we are still in a very young market. And you know, the infused product market, the manufactured product environment, while it's done really well in terms of starting to challenge some of the reasons why demand for infused products has been less than that of combustion-based products. Now that we're starting to see this combination of, one, really elegant product development approaches. So the food science that is going into the edibles that just make these extraordinarily delicious edibles, the fact that they have cannabis notwithstanding, to the fact that the science has now dramatically lowered the onset time, where if it used to take, you know, at least 30 minutes, sometimes 40 to 90 minutes before you felt the effects of infused products, now we're chasing the 5-minute onset threshold. These are phenomenal scientific changes that are not only creating phenomenal opportunity for product innovation, but also phenomenal opportunity for creating a much more refined consumer experience. And we've just begun to experiment with that, or to kind of innovate around that. And I think that's going to be a huge growth sector in the years to come. I
couldn't agree more.
You know, John, I was actually going to add on to that from our webinar on the infused. It's also the standards for what people or consumers want. You know, they're not going to accept something just because it's infused to have a bad taste or a bad smell. And people are really, really rising to that occasion. I feel like it's, you know, the standards for what people are expecting is getting higher, and people are matching that with the innovation and science and all this technology going into it.
Absolutely.
I think it also speaks to consumer demand for supply chain transparency and access to information about the products they're buying. There's a reason why we see more people buying in the legal market than we saw pre-legalization. They want to have that transparency, that access to information about what they're putting in and on their body. And I think cannabis is leading the charge in this way, and that unlike other industries where it can take days to weeks to months to identify the source of a contaminated product, with legal regulated cannabis, you can track and trace it back to the source with a few clicks. And this may seem obvious, but the illicit market is dangerous. And I think we saw how dangerous last fall with the vape issue. As cannabis has become more mainstream from the legal perspective, we've been able to give business owners and the public visibility into the plant, and not just at the point of sale, but across the entire supply chain from seed to sale to shelf. and more consumers and governments are looking for that data-driven transparency, visibility, to provide the safeguards that have helped propel the cannabis industry out of the shadows and toward broader acceptance, which certainly has been the case here in one of the oldest legal markets, which is setting the standard for what will lead to total legalization, I believe.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that.
Well, I was going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball, but since you're from the future, I can ask you this. So, as I said, that's 7.8 billion in sales. Now that cannabis has been declared an essential business in this post-COVID or COVID-19 world, how do you see the longer-term trajectory of the industry changing?
So, a couple things. I think people do have short memories. And as soon as all this is behind us, they might forget about the industry being essential. Where I think memories will be jogged are in those states struggling with economic recovery that recognize the contributions cannabis can make to the bottom line. Also, I think in this year, the will of the people is going to be seen in voting booths across the country, where I expect we'll see more state legalization, which will ultimately move the needle at the federal level. And even at the federal level, cannabis is such a bipartisan issue, you're not going to see either presidential candidate take a stand against it. And Biden, who, as we know, has had a mixed history with cannabis, of course, recently came out with that as a tenet of his campaign in the quest, I suppose, to win votes and to flip states from red to blue or blue to red. One only has to look at the numbers in Florida from the last presidential election, where Trump barely edged out Clinton in the statewide numbers, but cannabis legalization, the medical cannabis initiative, passed by a more than 70% threshold. We are going to see the economic change from this downturn, I do think, drive legalization. And I know that's a popular topic, but money talks and taxes talk and job creation talks.
I completely agree with that, and I think the job creation point is going to be particularly a particularly pointed issue, not only amongst the states where cannabis, now that they were declared essential businesses, were able to forestall some of the job losses that you've seen in some other sectors of the economy, but also amongst the states where there's been this ongoing debate about whether to legalize, whether it's on the medical side or recreational side, that see a potential catalyst for the kinds of revenues that Colorado will have generated over this 6-year period. At a time that we're seeing these truly astonishing numbers of unemployment, of business losses, the fact that federal legalization just within legal regulated cannabis businesses could generate over 1 million jobs. Those are kinds of numbers that we're going to need every catalyst that we can find to drive the engine of this economy, or to restart the engine of this economy. I think there's a real conversation to be had there. And then on the essential businesses, one of the things that I think might actually be a lingering theme here in a post-COVID environment is the vape crisis was the first time where you got to cast a spotlight on some of the dangers of the unregulated market. I think the COVID environment has actually raised now new questions about how safe the cannabis you're getting is in the illicit environment, just in the interactions you're having with suppliers on the illicit side. You don't know where this cannabis is coming from. You don't know how it's being managed. Whereas when you look at the cannabis industry, which broadly speaking is operating to really high standards, and in often cases they're operating to medical grade standards, there's a great deal of assurance that there's a lot of protocols being placed toward ensuring consumer safety. And so for consumers in unregulated markets that are looking at the accommodations that are being made for cannabis consumers in legal markets, whether it's drive-through access, curbside pickup, the delivery services, and all of the sanitization and cleanliness protocols being affected. I think it is for people who've been illicit consumers and comfortable in that environment to start wondering, actually, there is in a COVID type environment utility in thinking about legalization because of the benefits that come from ensuring that this product is clean, safe, tested, and being delivered in a way that protects your health. And those, I think, are points that only further add the interest in and intensity around the conversation on legalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's amazing. Well, as far as, I mean, just the other point that I mentioned at the beginning about the kind of shift in, products sold from flour to different products. So in the past 6 years, it was nearly 2 million pounds of flour, 60 million edibles, 120,000 pounds of concentrate. What do you think is going to be the most, growth sector in the next 2 to 5 years?
Do you want to take that one first? I'm happy to.
Please, please.
Okay. For the past few years, I've done a series of predictions. And so far, I'm more than 80% success. So we'll see my track record this year.
Yeah.
One of my predictions is that cannabis becomes cool beyond THC and CBD. As cannabis legalization rolls out across the US, consumers have definitely gotten familiar with the two compounds currently in widespread use. There's, of course, THC, or the one that gets you high, and then there's cannabidiol, or CBD, which isn't psychoactive and is used by many for anxiety, depression, pain relief, and more. My outlook is we're in the very early stages of commercialization, educating the public, introducing new products, marketing legal cannabis to consumers. As John, as you mentioned earlier, there is a blue ocean of opportunity left in terms of branding. There are well over 400 different identified compounds that can be extracted from these plants. They're known as cannabinoids, and so far we are only talking about 2 of them, or 2 of them are only widely available in terms of testing and ingredient lists. And there are a handful of discovered cannabinoids that are already showing promising research that are primed to become the next CBD, such as CBG, CBC, CBV, CBN. CBN is the one showing the most promise for sleep. With my hectic schedule, I personally hope to see more products with this compound. I understand from some of the very early studies that a couple terpenes might make a difference, and I realize that this starts to sound a little bit of mumbo jumbo, and we will, much like we see in the wine industry, where some people will go to the grocery store and they just want to buy a red or a white, we will see, certainly I believe, others who have a much more refined quest for the feeling that they're looking for. And cannabis, of course, has a wide range of effect based on this entourage effect of the different compounds, the different cannabinoids that might be present in a product. So the data, the better data of tracking that, testing it, and manufacturers really being able to ensure a consistency and a consistency of experience for these products is critical. One of the things that we do with our Solo app is we collect consumer feedback data on how a particular product might make a consumer feel when they interact with the Solo code they can choose, and then we're able to correlate that back to the testing profile and start to build some hard data around what combinations make different people feel different ways.
That's a great point, and I think a really insightful perspective. Despite how long we have been consuming cannabis, one of the byproducts of prohibition over the past century, both domestically and largely globally, is that we actually still have a lot more science that needs to be done in understanding not only what the chemistry of cannabis is, the spectrum of not just cannabinoids, but other compounds in cannabis that amplify its effect, but also understanding how those compounds interact with the human biome. And there's a lot of research that's being initiated now. But we've barely scratched the tip of the iceberg. So looking out, one of the ideas that we've been thinking about is this idea of the transition from a one-size-fits-all approach to cannabis. We initially began with, is it a sativa or is it an indica, the 2 big strains and limiting to that. Then we got really deep into this strain segregation, and people got to learn about Girl Scout cookies and super lemon haze. Some of that still remains bewildering to some consumers, but and a lot of kind of cultivation science around that. But where I think we're starting to get to, where a path that we have begun to go down, is the transition from a one-size-fits-all to a one-size-fits-one, where with all of the attendant science around the compounds within cannabis, their effects, and specifically how individuals respond to cannabis, because all of our endocannabinoid systems are different, and therefore cannabis that might have one effect on, like a cannabis genetic that will have one effect on one person might behave very differently or react very differently in somebody else. And so as we start to combine these two tranches of science on the science around the compounds and the science around the human interaction component, I think the byproduct will be the ability to create products that create really refined and specialized experiences for individual consumers. And that's quite a ways down the road, but one can imagine that, particularly on the medical side, but even broadly on the kind of leisure, recreational, non-medical applications, the ability to really dial in your experience based on your genetic predisposition to cannabis, married with the science of the plant, I think is going to present phenomenal opportunity for this industry in the years to come.
Well, that's awesome. I had a conversation with our chief science advisor, Reggie, and we were talking about how California has been doing a lot of the cannabinoid that helps with weight loss, and I was like, I think our country will need that too after this COVID-19 lockdown.
That could end up being one of the most valuable cannabinoids in the market.
I know.
Particularly after this COVID snacking season.
Yeah, I think my new sport is eating carbs. So, well, we are almost out of time. Any parting words for our listeners? Nothing? Anything?
Well,
please, Jessica.
Sure. I think it's been nice to be able to be retrospective about the industry and share how far we've come in the last 6 years, or in my case, the last 11 years. And one theme that I've heard from both John and me throughout our chat today is that there's been such a renaissance in Colorado, and we have such a high number of adult use consumers here. I know the study that we co-authored a year or two ago, we found that the top 5 reasons that consumers choose cannabis are all health and wellness related. And so it is a different type of substance. It is a different type of product, and people do pursue it for more health and wellness based reasons than only escapism. And as we've said today, that is just going to drive further product adoption. These markets that have legalized are going to drive more consumers that are interested in trying this product for those health and wellness reasons and trying different products. And they're going to do it because they feel safe at the level that cannabis is being tracked, at the transparency and accountability that the tracking systems like the ones we developed here at Akerna are able to provide. And ultimately, that's going to drive economics. And the recession resilient nature of cannabis is going to be a great boon to us in the days and months and years ahead, I believe, and especially in terms of legalization.
I think that's a great point, Jessica. And I would just add, looking back at Colorado really does underscore 2 points. One, the scale of cannabis demand presents phenomenal opportunity for the jurisdictions that choose to legalize it. And as we think about just within the US, the number of states, major states, whether it's the New Yorks, New Jerseys, and Floridas that still have to transition to, that will be transitioning to adult use, or major states like Texas, which have yet to activate a full medical market. The potential growth here both domestically and internationally as more countries begin to contemplate legalization, will present a phenomenal long-term opportunity just in the way cannabis is currently being consumed. But when you overlay that against all of the opportunities for innovating consumer experiencing, innovating the way consumers engage with brands, innovating the retail experience. I mean, while it might feel like cannabis over the past 6 years has been well covered in the news and a well stabilized industry, I think we have barely scratched the tip of this iceberg. And if we think that the past 6 years of Colorado have been exciting and driven huge potential, we can't wait to see what the next 6 years will bring, both the countries and for the global cannabis economy. Huge potential lies ahead.
Awesome. Well, we'll wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. And thank you for joining us at CannaWeek. And be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast. Again, if you want to check out the infographic that was published by New Frontier Data, just hit newfrontierdata.com/CO-data. And I am your host, Heather Wicklund. I'll see you next time.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Oh my gosh,
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you,
Great.
Heather.
Awesome.